Greetings and salutations, everyone. Today we're going to take a look at slavery in colonial America, what it was like, its characteristics, and some of the major components of it. So, let's get started. In Europe, by this point, slavery was non-existent, and it was non-existent for a couple of reasons. Number one, most of the farms were relatively small, they were family run, they were not producing labor-intensive crops, and you didn't need a huge labor force for that. Would it be easier? Yes. Was it necessary? No. And the ease of it did not outweigh the cost of having slaves. And for these reasons, slavery was disappearing, decreasing, and virtually gone throughout most of Western Europe by this point. Those labor-intensive crops are what's going to really drive slavery in the Americas. Let's take a look at what they are. Here is our first one. That is tobacco. High heat, high humidity, lots of water. And when it's time to harvest this stuff, you got to harvest it. You got to pull it from the ground. You got to hang it, got to dry it. The dangerous parts of this is you can absorb the nicotine and tobacco chemicals through your fingertips. So even if you're not smoking, you are exposed to this stuff. This one is going to be sugar cane. That wonderful, delicious stuff. You need even hotter temperatures and even more water than tobacco. When you grow it, well, this is of all of them probably one of the more dangerous ones because there's so many steps that go into it. When the sugarcane is ready to be harvested, you have to cut it, and this sugarcane can grow as thick as your wrist, so you need a very sharp blade to do so. If you're not careful, you'll cut yourself. Once the sugarcane is all cut, you have to crush it, which is two giant rollers, or in some cases just a steamroller device that crushes the liquid out of the sugarcane. That is then boiled, and if you've ever experienced boiling sugar, you know how dangerous and unfun that can be. And then the whole thing is cooled in what is essentially a giant ice cream cone. And as it cools, the different layers of sugar are produced. You've got at the bottom, you've got your molasses, your just liquid sugar at that point. Then you've got dark brown sugar, light brown sugar, and at the top, that's where your money is. That is pure white sugar. That right there is going to be rice. Planted in water, it doesn't always need to stay in water. In fact, the longer it's growing, the more water is dangerous to it. This is dangerous because you're talking about lots of standing water in the summertime. So this is going to be where a lot of pathogens and mosquitoes love to live in this stuff. That right there, not so dangerous, but much less common. That is indigo. It is a very small flower, and if you take the stem of those very small flowers, you can grind them to create indigo dye, one of the wealthiest dyes that exist, especially for clothing. That doesn't look like much, but that is silver. Mining for silver is very dangerous because, you first have to mine it out. And by the 16th century, a Spanish chemist came up with a way of extracting silver from the rock using mercury. And it worked very, very good, but it also meant that anyone who's mining this stuff is exposed to lots of mercury and probably not going to have a good quality of life much longer. Our last one there, it is cotton. Until the 19th century, something that's not harvested a whole lot just because you have to pull it a certain way, otherwise you're going to get pricked on the thorns. Before you can turn it into anything, you have to pull it apart to get the seeds out, and this is very labor intensive. Yeah, there's a lot of money to be made in it, but it's an active role in getting this crop to market. Slavery, as we have said before in this class, was a common thing in Africa prior to Europeans showing up. The European slave traders would usually purchase the slaves from the tribes. Those tribes already had slaves, so it really wasn't that big of a push to sell the slaves to someone else. And the thing that was most frequently used to buy the slaves was guns. And from this, you get a really vicious cycle where one tribe will conquer another tribe, enslave them, sell them to the Europeans, have more guns, then have more reason to go conquer the next tribe to keep it going. And this was the way of things for centuries, and it's horrible to think of, but that was considered the norm. This picture here depicts how tightly slaves were packed into the slave ships. This is a Dutch cutout. It is inconceivable to consider how bad the trip from Africa to the Americas were. If you got sick, if you died, you were just thrown overboard. And this was in the middle of the Atlantic. There is no hope for rescue. There's no hope for swimming to shore at that point. The Triangle Trade Network was a three-part trade network. Let's take a look at it, where ships would pick up slaves from Africa, take the slaves to the Americas. Most of those slaves are going to go to the West Indies and Brazil. The slaves are taken off the ships, the slaves are then sold, the ships are then cleaned, and the trip from Africa to the Americas is about 8 weeks. So it's a real long time for anybody, especially these slaves who are chained to the deck, chained to bedposts and unable to move. Once the ships are cleaned and the slaves have all been sold, the ships then fill up on whatever is being produced in that region. It might be cotton or sugar or tobacco or molasses or whatever. And then that stuff, the raw material, goes back to Europe, and that is then sold in the markets there. Once that is sold, the ships go back to Africa, now carrying those manufactured goods, guns, clocks, some stuff like that, and new slaves are bought. This network would see lots of money, lots of people, lots of stuff moving back and forth. It was a three-part trade network, and each arm relied on the previous one to keep it moving. There were three distinctive slave systems that existed in colonial North America by the mid-18th century. The tobacco-based plantations in the Chesapeake, the rice plantations in South Carolina and Georgia, and the non-plantation slaves in New England and the Middle Colonies. So let's take a look at the Chesapeake region. The tobacco plantations in the Chesapeake were the oldest of these three, and about half of all the region was made up of slaves. Tobacco-based slavery was a main income for these plantations, and following Bacon's rebellions, more and more planters, more of the wealthy elite, are going to defend and then encourage the idea that slavery needed to be a thing. In the rice plantations of the Carolinas, we see that initially Native Americans were used as the slave labor here. And some tribes, the Creek for example, would attack other tribes and then sell those captured Native Americans to white folk, this time in exchange for deer skin or fur or maybe a knife or a gun. But it was typically something from the animal world. And in exchange for this didn't go on for too long though, because number one, the Native Americans realized pretty quickly, oh, sooner or later they're going to want to enslave all of us. Number two, the Native Americans had a lot better way to leave. And number three, disease. Rice cultivation, growing of rice in the low countries of South Carolina, brought in lots more people, lots more African slaves, which increased that racial divide that already existed. South Carolina is going to be the first colony that has a predominantly African majority. African Americans are familiar enough with rice because it's also grown back in Africa. Rice radically transformed the South Carolinian society. Racism is more consistent. We see that after indigo shows up, it's going to be used more. growing rice means you need to do a lot of stuff. You need a lot of money. You have to grow it first in water, then you have to drain the water, so there's a lot of money there that goes into that. You have to worry about mosquitoes carrying malaria, and Africans, if you were born in Africa, Africans had developed sickle cell anemia, which is a partial immunity to malaria, at least to the more extreme parts of, and then they died parts of malaria. We see in the rice kingdoms, the task system was used where slaves were given specific tasks to do for a day, and once they're all done, then you're done for the day. The motivation for this was more stuff will get done, and it was. Rice also started spreading into Georgia, and the colony is going to be established in 1733 by this man, James Oglethorpe. He believed that a new colony needed to be created, a place for the quote-unquote worthy poor of England, those British folks who were down on their luck and just needed a second chance. And the British government wanted this colony to exist as well. They thought that it would further safeguard their more northern colonies, as far north as even South Carolina was considered north, against the Spanish, against the Native Americans in Florida. The colony initially banned liquor and slaves. Oglethorpe wanted this to be a more moralistic idea. And throughout the 1740s, that's the case. However, the colony was in danger of not being profitable and in danger of relying more and more on the British government and less on the proprietors. So in 1751, the proprietors surrendered the colony to the British Crown. After that point, England takes control of Georgia, and they allow slaves in and they allow liquor in. The farther north you go, the role of slavery in the face of slavery definitely changes. New England and your middle colonies really didn't see much slavery. I mean, there were still slaves, but not for the same things. You could take a slave up here to New England, and New England recognized that, those two people are married and they're slaves, so that's okay. In New England, a slave could even testify in court, something that did not exist in the South. We see that wage labor becomes more prominent in the North, and if you had the ability to work as a skilled craftsman, a skilled worker, then you could get a job doing this. This chart right here shows the slave population as a percentage of the total population of the colonies. And this is on the eve of the American Revolution. And you can see New Hampshire, they're at the top at 1%, but our big group is going to be South Carolina. 61% of the populace is slave. And when we look at the role of African Black and becoming African American, we see that the path of becoming African American was a rugged one. When you look at Native Americans and Africans, they were a divisive group. These groups may speak entirely different languages, practice many different religions, different kinds of art, different kinds of culture. In Africa, we may see tribes practicing forms of animism and shamanism, just like we saw the Native Americans doing. And a lot of this stuff would transition in one shape or another into early African American Christianity. The Chesapeake area sees a huge boom in slave population because they're reproducing here, whether with each other or with whites. But when you look further south, that's not the case. South Carolina and Georgia, the work is much more difficult, and there is just as much population of bringing in new slaves as there is from, good old reproduction. And the farther north you go, you have more mobility than people farther south. This meant both social mobility as well as physical mobility. When we look at how many African slaves were in the Americas, one question that keeps coming up time and again is, why not run away? Why not fight back? And it did happen. The most common way of a slave uprising, of resisting, could be to work slower, to break a tool, but we do see the big uprisings happen. And the first big slave uprising that took place happens in New York, happens in 1712. A group of slaves burn a building, they kill some whites who show up to try to put the fire out. Eventually these slaves were caught, they were tortured, then they were burned alive as a threat to all the other slaves in town. Don't rise up, don't fight back. And this runaway picture here depicts what, and this really came from the 18th century, the danger that was felt of, a runaway slave. It's as general as it could be. It's names of people, vague definitions of folks, and there's always the option for a reward. You can return this runaway slave and we'll give you money. And if you found someone who fit that description, you might be enticed to want to turn them in for some cash. And sometimes a slave was returned, and sometimes a different person who was never a slave was then enslaved, and things get very bad after that. In 1739, England and Spain go to war over Jenkins' ear. It's a very simple story of a soldier who lost an ear in a fight. Ultimately, the thing that comes out of this is the Stono Rebellions. This was a group of slaves who start heading for Florida. They were from South Carolina. They viewed the war happening as an opportunity to escape, so they do. They head to Florida, killing whites along the way, shouting liberty as they went. Ultimately, though, this group was all caught, all killed, and then we see harsher slave laws put into play. The last colonial one we're going to look at is the 1741 crisis. This one again took place in New York, and there was a series of fires that began, and just rumor and speculation led people to believe that the slaves were about to rebel, and there were some white folks who were going to help spirit them away. And the fear of this was so grand that people reacted on just that. 150 blacks, 20 whites are arrested, 34 more are going to be executed. Every time we see a slave rebellion, a slave uprising happen, it is immediately followed by everyone involved who's caught gets dead, and harsher, stricter slave codes are put into place. So, today we talked about slavery in colonial America. I hope you learned something. I'll see you next time.